Welcome to Chatham House today, and welcome to this session on Senegal and the Plan Senegal Emergent, the Emerging Senegal Plan. I have with me Mr. Sige Diagne, Advisor to the Minister of Economics, Planning and Cooperation of the Republic of Senegal. So he's going to make some opening remarks, and then we'll move to just a fairly free discussion. And for your information, this meeting is on the record. It's not the Chatham House rule, non-attribution. It's on the record, so everything is public and in open space for discussion. Monsieur Diagne, would you like to?
Voilà. Bonjour.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
A Chatham Rule, it's one of the Chatham House or the Royal Institute of International Affairs, as I also call, I recall that you were called. Excellency, the Ambassador of the UK in Senegal, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Senegal is honored to be partaking into this week's at the Forum on Investments for Francophone countries. I wanted to just talk about very quickly, Senegal, give an overview of Senegal, our economic development plan, some of our strategic opportunities, and where we see further collaboration with the UK. Senegal is on the westernmost tip of Africa, so we are bordered by the Atlantic Ocean on the west, and then we've got our neighbors Guinea, Mauritania, Mali. 17.7 million people. Interesting fact, 73% less than 35. So we're a very youthful population, average age of about 19 years old. So the demographic dividend from a growth perspective is huge. Talking about Africa in general, as you know, it's today 1.4 billion people. It is expected to be 2.5 billion people by 2050. Most of it was going to be youth, and therefore having a youthful population requires strong investments in health, in infrastructure, and in education in order to carry on that growth, and that is where the Plan Senegal Emergent, which is our economic development plan, is axed. It's got three pillars. The first pillar is the structural transformation of the economy. So that means that we need massive, large-scale infrastructure investments in order to propulse our economic development. So in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, from 2014 to 2018, we made a lot of investments in infrastructure. Think about roads, ports, railroads, a new airport, a new express train, which enable us to sustain over 6% in terms of economic growth. So between 2014 and 2018, which was the first phase, we had about over 6.2% in annual growth. We experienced some slowdown in 2019 to about 4.4%. However, in 2020, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and we were not, everybody was affected. Africa, in general, as a continent, experienced its first recession in over 50 years. Thankfully, because we had a strong primary sector driven by agriculture, we were actually able to grow. So we had a growth rate of 1.3% in 2020, much better than our peers. And so in order for us to go back into the sustained high single-digit, low double-digit growth, we needed to continue to reinvest. We took a lot of learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, which taught us that we need to, as we wanted to do, focus on our health, pharmaceutical, and agriculture sovereignty. And so a lot of our investments in our economic recovery are going to be axed around those, which were already priorities in the Plan Senegal Emergent, but we just need to accelerate them. And these were some of the lessons that we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. We are focused not only on those, we also focus on continuing to build infrastructure investments. We're also continuing to make a lot of reforms. Because today there are going to be limits as to how much the government can do from a public expenditure perspective. And so it is important for the private sector, which will be in our economic recovery plan, contributing about 39% of the overall plan. It's about a $26 billion plan, 14,712 billion francs CFA in local currency, to be more precise, will contribute 39%, which is in local currency 4,770 billion franc CFA. In order to crowd in not only private sector companies, but also investments, it is important to have the necessary environment in order to do so. So therefore, it requires reforms on improving the business environment. We are making transformational reforms. We've got reforms on improving the court system. We've got reforms on a new investment code, which will make our tax regime more friendly, easier to understand. We also have a very progressive, system for international investors, which allows easy repatriation and dividends, which, from a financial returns perspective, it is something interesting for investors to also know, to give them comfort that once they invest and they want to have money for their shareholders, it is something that they can certainly do so. We're also making investments at the heart of creating a national strategy for the development of the private sector. The private sector today, our goal is to create over 300 champions and over 3 million jobs over the next decade. And this is a strategy that is currently ongoing, and we want to present it in a form of a law, which will see us consolidate all the different actors in a different system in order to congregate them and see where the government can then jumpstart some initiatives and see how the private sector can grow. We continue to do a lot of advocacy on an international perspective in order to crowd in more private investments. The UK has been a very strong partner for us. The UK Export Finance has been doing a lot of good deals in Senegal and a lot of more deals in the pipeline, supporting us on our most priority initiatives in health, in sanitation. Sanitation is a huge issue in Senegal, and the UKF has a very interesting project at the heart of that, which we're hoping that by the end of the year we'll be able to close. Beyond that, I would say that the Senegal also has found an abundance of resources in terms of gas, and so as you know, one of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG 7, is universal access to electricity. We want to do that by 2025. Using gas instead of the coal, which is more polluting, is part of our transformational strategy, not only to provide energy, which is today our source of, let's say, a weakness, I would say, if you think about the competitiveness of the economy, but having gas, having it concessional financed, will enable us to have more industries. We want to create more industries, agribusinesses, etc., and you need to have competitive electricity and energy system in order to do so. And so that is a strategy that is also part of our structural transformation of the economy, which is in the first pillar. The second pillar, obviously, the gains you get there, you invest in your people. Who are our people today? Women and youth, who represent, as I mentioned, less than 73% of our population is below 35, and over half of our population are women. And we know that economically, if more women are empowered, the entire economy thrives and does better. So we have work to do that. The government has created instruments in order to not only invest in the youth from a financial perspective, but also from an economic and educational perspective. We have an organization called the DER, the Délégation à l'entrepreneuriat rapide des femmes et des jeunes, which has provided to over 122,000 youth and women with grants and financing in order to jumpstart their economic activities. We also have a Fonds souverain, FONSIS, Fonds souverain des investissements stratégiques, which is the sovereign wealth fund of the state that invests in our priority projects, which are around health, education, agriculture, among others. And we also have a guarantee fund called FONGIP, which will have guarantees, because today access to financing is one of the barriers to developing a robust ecosystem around entrepreneurship. And so having more guarantees to make the governments, the banks more comfortable to lending is also something on the pipe. So the second pillar is on education and health. We also have we have national programs to have a vocational training in each department in Senegal. So one department, one vocational training. We have about 46 departments in Senegal, and we really want to double down on training, because going forward, we think that Africa will be providing the necessary main-d'oeuvre and supply to the rest of the world because of its youthful population. So if we're able to invest in their health and in their education, we can make the world, we can then provide the necessary labor to the rest of the world. As you know, the Europe and Asia, they're more aging populations. And so therefore, with the youthful population coming into Africa, that will naturally feed in on the vacuum. The third one is on governance and peace and stability. Obviously, Senegal has been a strong and stable democracy. It's been a democracy jewel in Africa. It is no secret that unfortunately we are still dealing with some political uncertainty around the region. To be honest, but Senegal has always prided itself in its strong and stable democracy, and I think Her Excellency the Ambassador can attest to that. That has been one of our driving forces and why investors find Senegal so attractive. Politically stable, we've had peaceful transitions to power. When you have the Socialist Party to the Democratic Party to the party that is currently ruling, it's always been peaceful, and always the power belongs to the people, and that is something that is part of our DNA, and we pride ourselves, and we make sure that the investors know that today that is one of our the crux of why we are beyond our geographical position, why we are also attractive. So those are at a high level, our economic development plan. Going forward, obviously, as we're coming back from the pandemic, we're dealing with multiple crises. There's food insecurity. We've got still a health crisis from the COVID. We still continue to deal with the economic crisis as a result of the health crisis. You also have a conflict crisis around the north. And so all of those things are hitting us all at once, but because our economy has been resilient and we've seen it from the COVID, we're continuing to sustain it. So we're seeing growth rates above 10% going in 2023 and 2024 as we start having in more gas resources coming into the budget, and then we'll get to a steady state growth rate beyond 7% going forward by 2035, which is the horizon of the Plan Senegal Emergent. So in conclusion, Senegal is a very attractive place to invest, a very politically stable democracy, a large and youthful population that is ready to work, that is educated and has infrastructure, investing strongly in its institutions and governance, and also making transformational reforms to attract more private sector investment, not only local, but also internationally. An opportunity to also not only make financial returns, but also social returns as impact investors. And finally, a good overall environment to live in, given the climate. It's a very temperate climate. We only have 2 seasons. 95% of the days you have sun, like today, a beautiful day. I understand it's not every day that it is sunny in London, but certainly it's sunny pretty much every day in Senegal. So those are the things that I wanted to highlight. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Monsieur Diane, for such a tour de force and a guide to the strategy and the thinking of the Emerging Senegal plan. And because time is tight, we'll move straight to questions. Please introduce yourself very briefly when you put the question, and please keep the question as a question and not a sort of debating comment. Thank you very much. Who would like to put the
Thank you very much. Emmanuel Kwapon, Standard Chartered. I think my question goes to the financing, and you talked about 39% of the PSE under the second phase coming from the private sector. Clearly, you also highlighted that a lot of the first phase spending was from the public sector, and rightly so. We've seen debt rise quite significantly in the back of that. More recently, the shocks that we've seen have meant that the deficits have been much wider and have even added to that. Given the tightening global financial conditions, I know there's been a PPP framework trying to encourage more private sector investment. What has that brought about? Could you talk about pipeline investments that you've got, and what real percentage of this 39% has already been secured? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I apologize I didn't get your name, but I know it's from Standard Chartered. I want to say that Standard Chartered is one of our strongest partners in Senegal. We've done a lot of deals, so we want to thank Standard Chartered for the appetite and the consideration that they have for our country. It is true in the overall global environment, yes, you do have the debt levels rising. and now I want to touch on that very directly. Because of the ongoing geopolitical climate, which is the war in Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions, we have been negatively affected. So 3.5% of our GDP has been used on energy and food subsidies. And these were because of our budget was set on $75 a barrel, but obviously you saw oil prices reaching almost $120 in the summertime, which necessarily, because we are an economy where we cannot pass through some of those costs to the customers, the government had to take on that. As a result, which meant that debt levels had increased. Our debt level in Senegal is still sustainable. It is still sustainable. I just came back from Washington, D.C., at the IMF and World Bank meetings, and these were some of the discussions that we had with the Bretton Woods organizations. So therefore, we still have room to do more public expenditure, but obviously there's going to be limits. And that's why the new PPP framework is something that we are continuing to focus on, to continue to market and on continuing to educate investors on. We already have a pipeline of projects. We're going to have a PPP, I would say, a PPP forum in Senegal at the beginning of January, where we're going to unveil already the pipeline of projects that we have. I know UKF has already been working with us on that in the north of Senegal. And so there's a robust pipeline. I don't have an answer on top of my head in terms of the 39%, how much has been realized to date, because it is an horizon up until the end of 2023. But I can already tell you that we've already been doing some PPP projects. We have a very, very strong pipeline, a lot of it in the health sector, building in hospitals. We have some in education. The vocational training also, we have it. A big chunk of it is in PPP, and that's something we're negotiating as we speak. And so we're able to do those. Obviously, there's still some that we need to do as a government in terms of jump-starting, because the idea is, if we have the necessary environment, every dollar that the government puts, we're able to leverage that to get 3 or 4 times private sector money. That is really the blended finance objective that we're trying to get. And so that is a strategy that we're working on. And so far, in a couple of toll roads, that's actually what we've been doing. We've already done PPPs in Senegal. Our toll road today, when you're going from the airport going into Dakar, is a PPP, and that model has been very successful for the government and for the private entity, and that's a model that we look to proliferate. So fundamentals are still strong in Senegal. Debt levels are concerning, but they're still sustainable, but they're not an alarm. And our outlook from a Moody's and Standard & Poor as BA3, B+, is still stable. Thank you.
Can I ask you to talk a bit about the geographical balance of development? Because we can see that in Dakar and Thiès, and obviously that you have the coastal location, the big cities, a lot of dynamism, all this infrastructure you've talked about. But there are large rural areas and provincial cities, particularly inland, a long way from the coast. How do you think you're going to get development in those areas, because they're not the obvious locations, and yet obviously, as we've seen elsewhere in the Sahel, once you get social problems in rural areas, afterwards that can have consequences for stability as well.
Very, very good, important question. Thank you very much, Chair, for that. I don't know how many people have been to Senegal, but this is something also, Her Excellency, I would love to get your thoughts on it, obviously, as you've traveled across the country. One of the things that I mentioned, which is on, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of access, universal access to energy. We've made a lot of inroads in making rural electrification a reality. I don't have I think we're around the 70s in terms of electrification. When we used to be in the 26% a decade ago, it's 96% in the urban area. So we've already seen some benefits in order having more access to electricity in the rural areas in terms of how much economic development that can engender. We have a ministry called le Ministère du Développement Communautaire, or for development communities, et des collectivités territoriales. Territorial collectivities, maybe to translate. that is in charge of some of these economic development and bridging the gap between rural and urban divide. And the biggest threat, I think, to stability is poverty. And that is something that we want to bridge the gap between that. So that's why we're investing. I can talk about one flagship project in order to illustrate that. We have a big, in part of our structural transformation, we're putting in these, what we call agropole. Agropole are these zones of industrial transformation. We have about 5 of them across the country, so 5 poles. And each pole would be dedicated to a particular crop. So in the south, in the agropole south, you have mangoes and cashews are going to be the main crops that we're going to be transforming. Because today, we're exporting, let's say, raw materials, and then we're importing finished goods. So all of the, from a value chain perspective, all of the transformation is done abroad. And it's not good from our balance of payment and also from our currency and reserve asset, because you're not exporting raw and you're importing finished goods. So that's why we want to do more local transformation. And these are not in, let's say, urban areas. These are right at the heart of where the agriculture is taking place. So it is impacting a lot of communities of subsistence farmers, and we are engaging in, let's say, on when we have developers who are going to engage in buying in all of their production upfront, so guaranteeing them some liquidity and some predictability in order to do the local transformation. It is also empowering local communities. It's also setting up opportunities for us to do more vocational training, to do more agriculture that is more advanced, that leverages the latest technologies, the latest know-hows, so that we can be very advanced in it. Because today, if you think about Africa in general, 60% of all arable lands in the world is in Africa, and we have quite a lot of it, and our agriculture is not fully exploited yet. So with these transformational industrial transformation zones, it's going to be a huge step forward into bridging that rural versus urban divide. And we're working directly with the governors of the states, with the mayors of the departments, and then and the local communities, in order to realize that and make sure that the populations there are the ones who are going to be first and foremost impacted. The second one that I would mention is also we're also doing a lot of infrastructure investments. The UKF is supporting us on a very large scale project in Senegal that is a plan spécial de désenclavement, which is across the territory, a lot of the places in the south. And that is going to create a lot of infrastructures that will allow us to also do a lot more transportation from point A to point B. If I take the example, for example, of mangoes, 50% of our what we collect is wasted in transportation. Think about the opportunity cost that represents, and having the infrastructure as the backbone of our economy, working hand in hand with the local communities, in that some of them will be displaced, but they'll be necessarily compensated, will allow us for them to reap the benefits of all of this development that we're trying to do. So, Chair, that is my answer to you in terms of geographical balance. I think I would just lastly just touch upon overall, I think in because you mentioned the Sahel region, which is obviously something a source of concern. We're spending 1 to 2% of our GDP on defense, on defense spending, and we're continuing to reinforce that. We know the UK. We have discussions. They're a partner. We have strong partners who are helping us on security, because we think that a strong, consolidated Senegal is going to be good for Africa.
Thank you. Who has another question? Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Emmanuel once again. This time it's got to do with the electricity, energy that you talked about, your target for 2025. And you alluded to the oil and gas, making use of the gas
Yes.
To power that. Maybe if you could give an update in terms of where we are. I believe there is no FID on the gas field for that. I know the GTA, that's largely going to be for export, but the one for domestic, I believe that's still not got into any FID. The infrastructure to convert from heavy fuel oils to gas, that's also not started. So how realistic is that 2025 target? And is that something you think you can still achieve?
I was like, you know a lot, huh? Standard Chartered. Yeah, so look, Target for 2025 did not think that COVID was going to happen, and did not think that the global geopolitical crisis were going to happen. So obviously that takes a hit, realistically. That is still the target we're marching towards. Obviously, it will require extra effort, but there's not been any deviation from reaching that objective. That being said, we need our partners. We need bilateral and multilateral partners to continue to invest into that sector. In terms of gas, I don't want to talk about it in too much detail because some of this information is still confidential within the government. I would say it at a high level like this: the rationale for gas. Today, 640 million Africans do not have access to energy. And I think everybody in this room knows the benefit of having access to electricity and energy at a reasonable cost. And as I mentioned earlier, if our population is going to reach 2.5 billion in 2050, that's like in 30 years. So the needs of electricity are going to skyrocket. And so you need to have access to affordable and clean energy. Today, our renewable energy mix in Senegal is about 32%. We did it at 32% at a time when it was very expensive to do, and at a time where nobody else around us was doing it. And so we, from our long-term perspective, are mindful of the mix of having more renewable. But we think gas as a substitute for what we're getting today, which is coal, is cleaner for the energy. And overall in Africa, today, Africa is only responsible for 3% of global emissions. And if we're able to use all 5,000 billion cubic meters of the gas that has been unexploited, the cumulative emissions is only going to be 3.5%. So it's a small drop in the bucket. It is not the 3 or 4 countries that we know are responsible for half of the emissions in the world. So therefore, and we were at just the G20 meetings at the World Bank and the IMF, and as we're preparing for the Leaders Summit in Bali next month, that is one of the messages as Africa today, as we're chairing the Africa Union, we continue to do. It is important for us as Africa to continue to leverage our natural resources for economic development as a transition phase. The specifics on how we're exploiting the gas in terms of GTA and others, I wouldn't want to get into that because some of it is confidential, but we have partners who are already interested. We are in negotiation. The Ministry of Petroleum and Energy and ourselves, the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Cooperation, are doing just energy transition partnerships. We already have some partners in France and Germany, and these are conversations that we have with other partners. And we believe that people understand the rationale for why we want to do this strategy. It is at the core of our economic development, and I think we will get there. And we hope that Standard Chartered, as they have been very supportive in the past in many of our projects, and will continue to support us in that.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. As you were thinking, I was revising my questions. You answer it and I change and cancel. My name is Timothy Modu. I'm a member of Chatham House, but also I run an advisory service, strategic development advisory called SIDA Advisory, SIDA Africa. And we work with capital market development with both London Stock Exchange and a few other areas. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One of them is on do you have any information, if it's available, on the largest single foreign investment project that's come in? Because the reason I ask is about the capacity of countries. It's easy to talk about foreign investors, and if you bring a 10 billion program, you realize that some of African countries haven't got the capacity to handle immediate 10 billion, or if people want to take their money back, you might not have the capacity. So there are cases, experiences I've had, where people have come in, they got the percentage profit they wanted to make. If you guarantee and say, look, there's opportunity here, the investors come in and they get their 50% profit. When it comes to the exchange rate, you'd be lucky if by the time you do finish your exchange rate mechanism, you still get your capital back. So are there mechanisms to check that investments? That's a convoluted question, but you know what I'm getting at. But the other question that's important to me is on diaspora interest. You keep using the word Africa. So I take it that every African who is a diaspora and who's looking at countries. I mean, I like the fact that you say that there's some political stability, which is what most diasporans are worried about. So are there kind of scheme, are you interested in entertaining diaspora thinking, African diaspora thinking, in terms of bringing funds already to investment? So that's something. And the final one is that do you have any specific working relationship, on how you're developing your internal capital market? I say that specifically because I've worked with London Stock Exchange for over 11 years on the whole idea of not just getting companies to quote here, but for the exchange to help to deepen the internal capital market for the private sector in various African countries. And I'll be more than happy to sort of help in that direction if you wanted to talk to London Stock Exchange more specifically on my area of private sector capital development as part of your infrastructure program. I just thought I'd put it out there.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting and important questions, and very finance heavy. So I will put on a finance hat for a second. I'll maybe start in reverse. Working relationship with on international capital markets. I have a colleague who is in charge of our local capital markets, the UMOA region,
right.
And then I'm happy to then specifically link up the two of you together. What I would say on that is today, globally, when you think about a government's financing strategy, you look at domestic resource mobilization, then you look at the international, maybe the Eurobond market. Today it's a challenge to do Eurobonds because we're getting interest rates at 10% and above, which is still much higher than anything that we would expect. Our bonds are pricing on the repo market at very high rates. So that market has been close to us, and therefore, and this is why it's so important to have a very liquid local currency capital markets, because when international markets are closed or where the pricing does not reflect the economic realities, then you have other solutions. And so we're pushing on getting more concessional financing for bilateral and multilateral partners, but also pushing in the depth in terms of our local capital market in order to raise more local currency. And so this is a area that has been even more important given the current macro situation that, with us, Ministry of Economy, also Ministry of Finance and Budget is strongly focused on. Our financing strategy going forward we just had our new law of finance with the budget. It's almost roughly 10 billion. And so part of the financing strategy is to say, how do we raise external financing at the most concessional rates possible? And so exploring that opportunity with your services, that would be something that I would love to talk offline about. The second one on the diaspora interest, I am, a diaspora myself. I did spend time in other countries as well, and had always had an interest in Senegal. Made the jump to go back to Senegal, but I was in the United States beforehand, and that link, from a government perspective, I can say in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's I would say, a junior minister just in charge of the diaspora, because it is so important. It's not just diaspora maintaining relationship with the embassies, but it's also gaining all of the human capital, the know-how, the knowledge. We have technocrats across all different industries that I think we can use in order to influence positively our policies in government. So we're continuing to find ways, so for example, in these type of fora, or when we travel, when we meet with the diaspora, as we do government officials, to meet with our local diaspora, to seek their knowledge. Because the reality is today the diaspora is even more important. Historically, it's been focused a lot on remittances because the diaspora would then supplement on some of the income. So that was the economic relationship that we have. But we need to do a better job of leveraging their overall human capital knowledge, people who are leaders in technology, in oil and gas, in education across the world. Then how can they then leverage that? I'll give you an example on how we were able to do that. In May 2021, Senegal and France co-chaired a summit on financing of African economies, which was when we jumpstart the whole special drawing rights, the SCR allocations, where we got 650 billion overall allocated. And one of the topics that we're talking about is reallocation of $100 billion. And the UK has been one of the strongest proponents on reallocating it to the multilateral development banks like the African development banks. And we're still finding a way to make sure that we can do that while respecting the legal frameworks as well as respecting their reserve asset status. And these things also, we have people from the diaspora who's been advising us on how some of these mechanisms are actually working. Some of the diaspora who are working at the African Development Bank, who are working at the IMF, who are working at the World Bank, when we met them, they said, listen, maybe from a government perspective, these are X, Y, and Z that you can do. So I think we're doing a better job, but we just need to find a way to institutionalize it and make it something that is going to be that is going to date us who are currently in government. And then the first question you asked on the largest single foreign investment, I can't say the name, but I can say that, as obviously in the UK, is a very, very important partner of Senegal. I'm not going to say if the largest, certainly one of the largest. And they've been very active, and we hope that the UK continue to play its leading role in the structural transformation of our economies.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Nathan Hayes from the Economist Intelligence Unit. You mentioned about the industrial transformation poles and promoting processing of agricultural and focus on 5 different crops. I was wondering if you could comment on the level of domestic processing at the moment and growth targets moving forwards, and if there's been a lot of commercial interest on the back of the ongoing reform programs in investing in domestic agricultural processing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like I said, the level of domestic processing is not anywhere where we want it to be because we're still just exporting mostly raw material, raw crops. I know there's a couple of the British companies that I know that who are working in the north of Senegal who are actually supplying onions,
Yes.
to spring onions to some of the local supermarkets. I'd love also if Her Excellency can, as with the field experience on that. With this strategy, we want to move up the value chain where we're able to export. The example of Cote d'Ivoire that I use is if they're exporting raw cocoa, they import chocolate. And we want to be able to produce chocolate locally. And that's for us. If you think about mangoes, you can do mango jellies, you can do many other things with it. And that's how you actually create sustainable jobs. The secondary sector for Senegal, which is where the industry is about 20% of GDP. We want that to be at least 25% going forward. It's hovered around anywhere from 18, 19%. It's reached 20%. And I guess one of the barriers is the energy cost, which we know, and we have a strategy behind it. So this is certainly something that if it plays out, we can see that share going in. We're also seeing that there are price pressures in Asian countries, so we can see that some of that coming down into our countries. But in order to be that, we need to be ready to welcome all that, the movement of manufacturing, local manufacturing. The UK had a local manufacturing in Africa initiative, which has helped us jumpstart our pharmaceutical industry. And with the help of the UK, we were able to do, for example, have a strategy on pharmaceutical sector, which will see us produce 50% of our pharmaceutical needs locally by 2035, 35% by 2030, and 25% by 2025. And we're well on our way, and we were able to make some of the reforms, which would have taken decades. For example, one of the reforms we're able to do is our health code has not been changed since 1954. Now, I don't know if everybody was born alive in 1954. Certainly, I was not. But the world has evolved, and since then, and we were able to do that thanks to the support that we had from the UK to that. And so we are seeing benefits in doing more local transformation, more domestic processing. We're further reinforced by the teachings of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we believe we're on our way. But specifically, low-value domestic processing, very, very low. You only have certain areas in which, we are doing more, maybe on the mining sector, but it's not the strategy where we want to be. We want to be moving up the value chain. The last program I'll mention, we have a program, I'll say it in French, Programme d'accélération de la compétitivité et de l'emploi. It's a program of acceleration of competitiveness and jobs that the Ministry of Economy is piloting, and we are doing strategies on certain value chains in order to have a value chain approach. So we're doing, on the tourism side, on the onion side, on the milk side, to see how can we move up on the value chain. We also have reverse, like an import substitution strategy. I think that was a playbook that a lot of the Latin American countries had used like in the 60s. We saw how that played out, but obviously you need to be mindful of the World Trade Organization kind of context in which not implement protectionist policies. So we're doing that also within the framework of liberalization. And so those are some of the things that we're doing because we want to encourage more domestic processing, and we're making the necessary investments for that.
Thank you very much. And do we have some more? Please go ahead.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Cherchi Adem, Economic Advisor in the Senegalese Embassy in London. Mr. Diane, thank you very much for your explanation and the questions and answers that you've given. You've provided an excellent presentation on the economic transformation of Senegal. We've talked a great deal about infrastructure, partnerships, but what I'd like to maybe elaborate a little bit is something that you've already mentioned, but I'd like to focus more on the partners that are around the table, and specifically about agriculture. As you know, this is the primary sector, and we need more support for that particular sector and more investment from our economic and financial partners, such as the UK. Currently, with the war in Ukraine, just to take one example, a lot of countries throughout the world have been impacted. They've had a lot of challenges with less wheat being available, the prices of wheat. All those are consequences of what we've all experienced. If we're going to try and develop our agriculture, this will provide Senegal more food sovereignty as well in the event of such crises, and it will also contribute to providing Senegal with food safety in order for the country to ensure its food safety and manage its food security, because that will encourage Senegal to produce more and diversify its production as well. Rice, corn, milk, for example, those are the ones that are in the highest demand. And I think they should be possible because Senegal has enough arable land. The advisor said earlier that Africa has over 60% of arable land in the world, where in Senegal we have huge expanses of arable land that are not yet exploited and that we could use for food production. We have land, but we also have water. Let's not forget that Senegal benefits from the Senegal River that flows through the country. We also have the Gambie and the Casamance rivers and other rivers that can be used in the agricultural sector. So we do have the land, we have the water, but we also need labor in order to produce. Now Senegal has a population of young people. 65% of the population is made up of young people, as we heard. We could use young people in the agricultural sector, which would help us reduce unemployment, but also to slow down the migration of young people towards foreign countries, because we have that phenomenon whereby young people leave the country. So if we give them jobs in agriculture, they might stay in the country. And that would be beneficial. Beyond that, I do think we also need to process whatever is produced locally, not just export our produce, but process products internally, which will boost the economy and allow our local population to find more jobs. Now, processing locally will also bring about more GDP. It will help our economy, of course. For a number of products, we know that Senegal can also cover a great part of its needs, onions, because we have a whole coastal area where Senegal produces a high volume of onions, and that actually meets all of the population's needs, and even with some of the produce being exported. Unfortunately, that's not the case for all of our production. So, and I will stop very soon. In summary, we need investment in agriculture in Senegal to allow the country to produce enough in volume, but also more diversification and more processing capacities locally. And that's where we would expect a bit more from our economic and financial partners, such as the UK. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you once again. I think it comes back again to your issue of financing that you raised earlier in response to the question. You were saying you were trying to develop the domestic market, trying to find more concessional financing. But I guess if you also look at the cost of the subsidies that you talked about, the energy subsidies, 3.5% of GDP, that's quite significant. And that is eating away at, spending that could be well used for something else, investments. I guess what I want to ask is, what is the plan towards making the subsidies more targeted? I know you have a plan towards moving to gas, but that's from 2025 onwards. In the meantime, before that starts, we have oil prices at this level. That's about 3% of GDP every year. That's going on to subsidies that are poorly targeted. What is the plan, I guess, broadly from the government to address that, to create some fiscal space to meet the much-needed development spending?
Thank you very much. Before I answer your question on that, I just wanted to, je voudrais juste remercier le conseil.
I'd like to thank the economic advisor for his brilliant presentation, really to insist upon the agricultural area, because it really is the agricultural sector which really gives rise to most of our growth as far as employment is concerned. It represents 60% of employment, and so therefore thank you so much, advisor, for having really insisted upon that, and also thank you for having presented your things in such a relevant or pertinent way. And I'm also delighted with what you said with regard to our resources as far as water is concerned, because after all, today we do have projects that are going to help us to get water from the river into arable land, and of course that requires also some capex, some investment, and they're projects upon which we want really our pastors to support us, because if we're going to really be able to succeed in agriculture and our lack of food, then we'll be able to have a sustainable economy. So thank you so much once again for having underlined that particular point and for having talked also about clandestine immigration.
To answer your question, as you were talking about it, there was part of your question that I wanted to mention. From a currency perspective, we're pegged to the euro, so there's no currency risk from that, and so for investors, at least. Yeah, on your IRR, at least you can remove the currency risk on that IRR calculation. In terms of the subsidies, making it more targeted, it is a very important, tough question and tough to implement. Literally, one of the first questions when we were with the World Bank was, how are you going to make it more targeted? Because obviously if you're doing everybody, we don't want to be subsidizing you, and as well as somebody else who lives in the rural area where you don't need the subsidy, but they do. We have not unveiled publicly the plans yet to do that. So we keep that under the chest for now. But those reflections are ongoing. I can talk about a couple of tools that we have that we were able to use. Cash transfer is something that was done by a lot of the countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. That can be targeted because we also have what's called the Registre National Unique, RNU, which is a database of about 1.1 million households. That's some of the more challenged households. And we actually used that when we had the resiliency plan to do distribution of like food. We were distributing oil, rice, sugar to those households back in 2020, which was 69 billion local franc CFA, about £1 billion. 69 billion CFA, $100 million in terms of transportation. And we learned a lot from it. We recently did a cash transfer, about 83 billion local CFA. That was very successful. So 43 billion, sorry. And so we have mechanisms in which we can reach some of those people. Now, the thing that we need to marry is if we give them the cash transfer, how we're going to maintain prices. Obviously, it's not always on us because also the world has been evolving. I mean, we're seeing some of the prices actually coming down and normalizing ever since we had the accord that was signed in Turkey in July, where at least the port of Odessa, over 136 vessels were unleashed to be able to give the grains in like the different ports, including Djibouti. That has been helpful. That has at least given a little bit of price stabilization, even though prices are still elevated. But there are initiatives that are correcting some of the things that we experienced in 2022. So the plan is to do targeted subsidy. We have ways in which we have done that in the past. But we're also exploring other ways in which we can make the subsidies more targeted. It is important on us. It will also help alleviate a little bit of the budget pressures that we're currently facing, and we're working with the IMF and the World Bank on those initiatives.
Great. Do we have any final round of questions? I've got one that I'd like to put to Monsieur Diagne, but who else in the room has a point? We'll just collect them all together for a final round if anybody would like to raise any further points.
It's really, for me, it's more sorry?
Yeah, so
it's more.
We'll take one, yourself first, then you, then I'll let mine at the end.
It's just on the vocational side of things. I'm particularly interested. The question for me really is it's to do with its standards, the capacity building side of things, whether there are programs that can be keyed in continuation of the diaspora line that we can key in. We're not just bringing our intellectual capacity, we actually have cash, to bring in. But we want to work in that sort of, so when I talk about it, I know what I'm talking about specifically, but the vocational training side of things and with the cash, I would put my money where I'm also knowing that I'm bringing the capacity to understand that may well be for international export. So I have particular interest in there. So, yeah, okay.
Any other question? Right, and then I'll just add mine on the end, and then perhaps, Monsieur Diagne, if you'd like to cover both in one go. My question is, look, Senegal's had big local elections, tough parliamentary elections. You have a very big presidential election coming up in 2024. We genuinely have no idea how that's going to turn out. So from the point of view of economic planning, how widely in the political space and among the different political parties and people across the political class are some of these economic issues, are the nuts and bolts, if you like, the details of some of this economic strategy talked about? We know that politics at one level is obviously very vocal and conflictual, but in terms of actually discussing among the different actors how Senegal will tackle these different political issues, is there yet much debate or exchange of ideas, exchange of policy suggestions? Because whoever wins the election afterwards, you as public servants are going to need to be able to develop an economic strategy that works with them. Thank you.
That is a loaded question. I wish I had a crystal ball to give you the answer and a magic 8 number to tell you how that's going to go. Chair, I'll answer your question last because it requires a little bit more thought, and I'll be very, meticulous on it. We definitely need the diaspora's cash. We do have a program called the FCPR, the Fonds Commun de Placement à Risque, which will allow us to have national savings, including diaspora savings, to invest in PPP projects as well as in positive return projects. We are working with CGF Bourse on it. We're hoping to operationalize that in 2023. But this is an avenue in which the diaspora can invest, and vocational training obviously is going to be one of the areas we will look at, so that you can get not only some financial returns but also the social returns in which you need, and make sure that maybe we can work to see how the governance can work on that and get home ideas and advisory on how we can make it work. So I would love just to offline to talk about it in more detail for that. And we want to just thank you for the interest and for the brilliant ideas you have for the diaspora, and these are giving us also thoughts that we can take back in-house at the ministry to see how we can better coordinate that and make sure that we have a more symbiotic and closer relations with our diaspora, both financially, socially, economically. Very much. Chair, yes, we did have local elections. We did have parliamentary elections. You saw the results, but you also saw the process. And it was, the incumbent has always accepted the outcome of the elections, and that's what I mean by politically stable. The opposition, yes, did gain ground, but the results have been accepted. We're staying the course. We had a cabinet reshuffle very recently in September. We have now a prime minister working on the lettre de politique générale, and the idea is to stay the course. And in terms of our economic development plans, in terms of the projects, is actually to accelerate the projects. So whatever project we have on the pipeline, the mandate is to accelerate them and to make them done. Next year is going to be a very important year, obviously. There's going to be political uncertainty, but it's nothing more than nothing beyond any other normal country. I understand that all countries go through it. I know that there was some uncertainty in the UK also recently. I sat at the G20 meeting on Tuesday night. Kwasi Kwarteng was there, made his remarks. The next day, obviously, somebody was there, but we found out and ended up happening. So these things happen, unfortunately. For us, we're just staying the course. We're still doing what we need to do. We're still talking with our partners, make sure that whatever is good for Senegal can withstand politics. And as a technical advisor, that is beyond, that is the way in which I can frame it. I don't have a political angle to it, but from a technocratic perspective, we're staying the course. Senegal is open for business. That's no matter what. That's how it's always been. We encourage you to think about us not only as Senegal. These are going to be my last, closing remarks. Not only as Senegal, but also as a gateway towards the ECOWAS region and broader Africa. Today, you're only 5 hours away, even less, from France, from the UK, from the United States. If you had a direct flight to Miami, it's 6 hours. Today to New York, it's 7 hours. So it's a privileged position to be in on a trade perspective. The ECOWAS region is about 300 million people. And so if you think about setting up, let's say, a pharmaceutical industry, just servicing Senegal would not be enough. You need scale. And it's a great entry point for you to develop the rest of Francophone Africa. It is home to some of the fastest growing economies, like Côte d'Ivoire. Nigeria is part of ECOWAS. That alone is 200 million people. And overall in Africa, it's $2.8 trillion in terms of economy. It's the 8th largest economy. And it's going to be 2.5 billion people. So if you think about it, it's going to be the next wave of consumers. So we will consume what the UK will produce, what France will produce, what the United States will produce. Rolls-Royce could be produced and consumed. And so we want to encourage you to think about Senegal as a gateway for the rest of Africa, because the continent is the future, and we see it in my everyday. And I am sure that Her Excellency also sees it in her privileged position of covering also a few other countries. And we have a very strong partnership with the UK. We have a very active embassy who's very pro-business, pro-economic development, who understands development and has seen other places. And we know that it's a good marriage between us, and we have a very close collaboration. And there's no language barrier. I think that's one of the things we need to demystify, that you have Francophone people who are perfectly fluent in English and who can speak a business language, who understands the technical terms, who can negotiate in good faith, and who can speak your language, and who can meet you halfway, and for you also to understand us beyond our social, economic, geographical differences. What unites us is greater than what divides us. We are open for business in English, in French, in Wolof, in Spanish, in German. We can do that, but for the UK, we welcome your investments, we welcome your thoughts, we welcome to continue our economic development. And we know that the instruments such as UAKF, BII, certainly have a lot more appetite for us. And we also hope that the private sector through them, can also have a lot more appetite for us. Thank you very much.